Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. I'll be reading Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. I'm FM Töpelmann, and it's desk time. When Gregor Samsa woke one morning from troubled dreams, he found that he had been transformed in his bed into a kind of giant bug. He lay on his back, which had become as hard as armor. Raising his head a little, he saw the arch of a brown abdomen divided into stiff, domed segments. The quilt was perched precariously on top and looked as if it might slide off at any moment. A regiment of puny legs, horribly thin compared to the rest of him, quivered wretchedly before his eyes. What on earth has happened to me, he wondered. It was no dream. His room, which altogether too small was designed for human occupation, breathed peacefully within its four familiar walls. Above the table, where a collection of cloth samples lay scattered, Samsa was a commercial traveler, hung the picture that he had recently cut from an illustrated magazine and placed in a pretty gilded frame. It showed a lady sitting upright, wearing a fur hat and boa, with her forearm plunged up to the elbow in a heavy fur muff. Gregor turned his gaze to the window. The dismal weather, raindrops rattled hard on the flashing, made him feel sad. What if I just go back to sleep for a bit longer and forget this nonsense, he thought. But with things as they stood, that was impossible. He was used to sleeping on his right side, and in present state there was no way he could adopt that position. The more he tried to force himself over onto his right, the more he kept falling onto his back. He tried 100 times, closing his eyes so that he did not have to look at his quivering legs, and only gave up when he began to feel a slight dull ache in his side, of a kind that he had He only gave up when he began to feel a slight dull ache in his side, of a kind that he had never experienced before. God, he thought, what an exhausting job I've chosen. On the road day in and day out, much more stressful than working from home. Apart from the demands of doing business, the actual traveling is so bad, struggling to catch connecting trains, terrible meals at all hours of the day and night, a sea of ever-changing faces, never any chance of making friends. To hell with it all! He felt a slight itch at the top of his stomach and slowly hauled himself to the bedpost on his back so that he could lift his head. There was a scattering of small white spots at the itchy place, but he had no idea what they meant. He wanted to explore the area with one of his legs, but he drew it back at once. The contact made his blood turn cold. He slid back down into his former position. Getting up at the crack of dawn like this, he said to himself, is enough to drive anyone completely insane. A man must have his sleep. The other salesmen live like kept women. When I get back to the hotel in the morning to process my orders, I find these gentlemen still at their breakfast. I'd like to see what my boss would say. If I tried that, I'd be out of my ear. Still, that might be a good thing. If I didn't have my parents to think of, I'd have handed in my notice long ago. I'd have gone to my boss and given him a piece of my mind. Knocked him off his perch. Ridiculous, the way he sits up on his high desk, so high that he can talk down to us workers from a lofty height. Especially when he's so hard of hearing. We all have to stand up close to him. Still, all hope is not lost. Once I've saved the money my parents owe him, which will be in 5 or 6 years, I'll definitely go through with it. Take the plunge. In the meantime, I better get up. My train goes in at 5. He looked at the alarm clock, ticking on the chest. Good God, he thought. It was already 6:30, and the minute hand was still creeping steadily towards... Now it was almost 6:45. Had the alarm simply failed? Even from bed, he could see that the clock was set correctly for 4 a.m. It had definitely gone off. Could he really have slept calmly through that earth-shattering alarm? Calmly, no. His sleep had been anything but peaceful. And yet he had slept perfectly soundly. What exactly, though, was he supposed to do now? The next train went in at 7. To catch it, he'd really have to get a move on. And he hadn't even packed his samples yet. Trouble was, he didn't feel the least bit rested or inclined to get up. Even if he did catch the train, his boss would come down on him hard. The office messenger would have been waiting on the 5 o'clock train, and it would be long since told the boss that Gregor hadn't turned up. The boy was the manager's creature, a wretched, sniveling toady. Supposing he called in sick, but that would cause its own problems and be suspicious too. During the 5 years he'd been in the firm, he'd never once had the slightest illness. The manager would turn up, the health insurance doctor. He would reproach his parents for their son's idleness and cut short all objections by repeating the doctor's refrain. There are no sick people in this world, only the work-shy. And would he be so far wrong in this case? Apart from the drowsiness that was entirely natural after such a long sleep, Gregor felt in fine form. He was even unusually hungry. All these thoughts were racing through his head. Before he'd actually made up his mind to get out of bed, the clock struck 7:15. There was a timid knock on the door by the head of his bed. "Gregor," someone called. It was his mother. "It was 7:15. Isn't it time you were on your way?" What a sweet voice! Gregor trembled as he heard his own in reply. It was unmistakably his voice, but it came with a kind of nasty whining undertone, which meant his words only took proper shape for an instant, and then were immediately muffled, so that you wondered if you'd really heard them in the first place. Gregor wanted to explain the situation fully, but given the circumstances, all he said was, "Yes, thank you, Mother, I'm getting up now." No doubt the door prevented his mother from noticing the change in Gregor's voice, for the explanation reassured her, and she shuffled away in her slippers. Even so, this little exchange had alerted the other members of the family to the fact that Gregor was still in the house. He'd never been this late before. His father started banging on one of the side doors softly with his fingers. "Gregor, Gregor," he called. "What's the matter?" And a moment later, in a louder voice, "Gregor, Gregor." From behind the door on the other side of the room, Gregor's sister called softly, "Gregor, are you ill? Do you need anything?" "I'm just coming," Gregor told them, forcing himself to enunciate carefully and separate each word with a long pause to keep his voice natural. His father went back to breakfast, but his sister kept whispering, "Gregor, open the door, please." Gregor, however, had absolutely no intention of complying. On the contrary, he was pleased he'd got into the habit of always locking the door on business trips. He wanted to get up and get dressed without anyone bothering him, and above all, he wanted his breakfast. After that, he'd take time to reflect. There was no way he could make any sensible decisions in bed. He remembered that he often got a mild ache or pain from sleeping awkwardly, which turned out to be imaginary, and disappeared as soon as he rose. He was eager to see if this was true of his present condition. As for the change of his voice, he thought privately it must be a sign of a nasty cold, the occupational hazard of a traveling salesman. He had no difficulty in getting rid of the quilt. He only had to puff himself up slightly, and it fell clear. After that, things became much more difficult, because his body was now so much broader. To get up, he needed his arms and hands, but all he had was dozens of little legs, which persisted in wriggling uncontrollably. Before he could bend one leg, first he had to stretch it out. When he'd finally managed to make that one behave, all the other little legs kept thrashing about in the most unpleasant and disgusting way. "I mustn't lie in bed like a useless lump," Gregor told himself. To get going, he tried to shift the lower part of his body out of bed. And the problem was that this bit of him, which, by the way, he hasn't yet managed to see or even imagine with any clarity, proved too difficult to move. Slowly beginning to panic, he gathered all of his strength and launched himself forward, but getting his aim wrong, he banged hard into one of the bedposts. The searing pain taught him immediately that the lower part of his body was the most sensitive. Next, he tried to maneuver the upper part of his body out of bed. Proceeding with great care, he rotated his head toward the edge of the bed. He managed quite easily. And the rest of him, despite its mass and size, slowly followed in the same direction. But once his head had cleared the side of the bed, and was hanging mid-air, he was so afraid to go any further. If he fell now, it would be a miracle if he didn't crack his skull. This was no time to knock himself unconscious. Better stay in bed. But then, panting with fatigue, he found himself stretched out exactly as before, saw his little legs quivering away more chaotically than ever. He despaired of finding a way of imposing order and peace on all this mess. Again, he was forced to the conclusion that he could not just stay in bed. Even if there was the slightest chance of success, then the most reasonable course of action was to get up. At the same time, he felt that cool and wise reflection would be far better than rushing into any rash decisions. At such moments, he usually turned his eyes to the window for encouragement and hope. But the fog stopped him from seeing across to the other side of the narrow street, and the view through the glass neither lifted his morale nor gave him confidence. 7 o'clock already, he said as the alarm clock struck the hour for the second time. 7 o'clock already, and the fog is still like pea soup. He lay back down again for a while, keeping his breathing shallow, as if, in the complete silence, he could wait calmly for everything, including himself, to return to normal. Then he said to himself, "Before it gets to 1:15, I absolutely have to get up. In any case, they'll send someone from the office, which opens at 7, to look for me before then." And he began to rock on his back in an effort to get his whole body out of bed in one go. That way, he would be able to project his head by snapping it upwards as he fell. His back seemed to be nice and hard, and no harm would come to him if he fell on that. His only fear was the resulting crash, which everyone in the whole house would surely hear, might cause panic, or at the very least make the others anxious. It was a risk he would just have to take. When Gregor had half his body out of his bed, the new way of going at it seemed more like a game than a struggle. Since all he had to do was rock himself on his back, he began to think how easily he could have done it if only he had a little help. 2 strong people, his father and the maid came to mind, would have managed it easily. All they would have needed to do was to get their arms under his curved back, lift it up from the bed, shift their weight and his quickly forward, and then simply wait, always taking due care until he was on the floor, where he hoped his feet would at last found some way of behaving sensibly. Even if the doors had not been closed, wouldn't it have been wise for him to call for help? In spite of the desperate circumstances, he couldn't hold back a smile at this thought. By now he was rocking so far, so hard, that he knew he was very close to tipping over, and knew he would have to make a serious decision. In 5 minutes, it would be 7:45. Suddenly there was a knock from the front door. Someone from the office, he thought, and he felt the blood freeze in his veins, while his little legs danced faster than ever. For a moment, all was quiet. They are not answering, Gregor thought with a wild surge of hope, but then he heard the maid's usual heavy footsteps as she went to the door and opened it. Gregor had to only hear the first words of the visitor's greeting to know who it was. The office manager in person. Why was Gregor, of all people, condemned to work for a firm which invariably took the most suspicious view of its employees and jumped hard on the first sign of any failing? Were all its employees really rogues? Was he the one good and faithful servant among them? Even if he had by chance missed a couple hours at work that morning, he was now so racked with remorse he simply couldn't get up. Couldn't they just have sent one of the trainees to sort things out if it really come to snooping around? Why did the manager himself have to come, as if to show the whole of Gregor's entirely blameless family that only someone of his stature could be trusted to clear up this regrettable affair? These thoughts annoyed Gregor so much that he swung himself out of bed with a last almighty heave. It made a loud thud, but not the terrible crash he had feared. The carpet had absorbed some of the impact, and Gregor's back was more flexible than he'd imagined, so the noise wasn't too bad. He'd only given his head a bit of a bang. He hadn't kept it high enough, and he'd taken a knock in the fall. Cross and in pain, he twisted his head and rubbed it on the carpet. "Something has just fallen in there," cried the manager in the room to the left. Gregor tried to imagine the look on his employer's face if he had been struck down by a misfortune like this. And why not? As if in brutal reply, the manager began to pace up and down the next room, which made his patent leather boots creak. Gregor's sister whispered a warning from the room to the right. "Gregor, your manager's here." "I know," Gregor muttered, but didn't dare raise his voice enough to have her hear. "Gregor," said his father in the room to the left, "the office manager has come to find out why you didn't catch the early train. We don't know what to say. He wants to speak to you in person, so please open the door. I'm sure you'll be kind enough to excuse the untidiness of your room." "Good morning, Mr. Samsa," the manager said in a friendly tone. That's where we'll leave it for today. The first hint of Gregor's professional world knocking on his door.